Okay, perfect. Recording started. Yeah, thanks for joining. Today we have one of our own professors, Blake Richards, for the T-Talk. He's a professor at McGill and also at the in computer science and also at the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery at McGill, and a core member, of course, at Mila. And I think he also is at Google.
Yes, I also have a part-time gig at Google.
Part-time gig at Google. It wasn't on his bio, but
yeah.
So yeah, thanks for joining. And he's going to talk today about brain-like learning with exponentiated gradients. So in general, the intersection of AI and neuroscience, that's the broad topic of Blake's research. And with that, I'll hand it over to him.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Benno. And it's my pleasure to do the T-Talk again. I think it's been 4 years since I've done the T-Talk. So quite a while. And I think that the Mila community will enjoy this particular piece of research, at least so far in my encounters with people in our area. They like this story. So as Benno said, my lab does research at the intersection of neuroscience and machine learning. This includes both trying to think about how we can take inspiration from the brain to improve machine learning systems, but also using machine learning theory to help us develop better theoretical models of computation in the brain. And today, what I'm going to be telling you about is something from the latter camp. It's some research that my group has done on how we can actually get a better hold on the learning rules of the brain by taking some inspiration from an area of machine learning theory known as mirror descent. Okay, so first I want to lay the groundwork here by talking about gradient descent and computational neuroscience. For those of you who don't do computational neuroscience, I think it's good just to highlight, well, and for those of you who do computational neuroscience, it's good to highlight the fact that when you're modeling learning in the brain, you have to ask yourself what your goal is, because there are different goals you can attempt to achieve by modeling the brain. If you're seeking to understand the physical mechanisms of information storage in the brain, then you probably want to build a biophysical model that actually corresponds to how real cells work down to the level of ionic currents and proteins and dendrite shapes and all that kind of stuff. Alternatively, you can have models that are phenomenological, where you take observations that you make about data in the brain, whether it be data about synaptic plasticity or just data about synapses themselves, and then build models that somehow mimic that phenomena and try to understand what the computational implications are. And then lastly, you can have normative models. That is, models where you train the model to actually accomplish some behavioral task of the sort that brains are capable of accomplishing. And these sorts of models are really critical for understanding how neural circuits in the brain can actually produce the non-toy behaviors that animals and humans are capable of producing. Now, of course, we ultimately want a multi-level model that links these different levels. And so part of what we're going to be looking at today is our attempt to take normative models and push towards the phenomenological direction a little bit better to get a better alignment between our normative models and the phenomena that we see in the brain. Now, normative models in neuroscience are nowadays all about gradient descent, and I think that is actually very appropriate. Many people have an initial reaction when I talk about gradient descent in the brain to say, well, surely the brain doesn't do gradient descent. We came up with this algorithm. What are the chances that this algorithm that we invented just happens to be how the brain does it? But actually, I think there's very deep reasons that the brain has to do something akin to gradient descent. First and foremost, we see that in high-dimensional systems, to date, we haven't actually developed any learning algorithms that work well that aren't at least correlated with gradient descent in terms of the weight updates that they propose. And here you're looking at the left at a study that my student Arna Ghosh did a couple of years ago, where we were looking at how much bias and variance can you add to your gradient and still do okay. And here you're looking at accuracy on CFAR 10 for a ResNet model. And you can introduce bias and variance into your gradient, but at some point you hit this cliff edge and you really just start getting terrible performance when you don't follow the gradient well enough. So, you know, another reason is that if you think about it, actually, if you are making small enough step sizes in your parameters or in your synapses, as it were, then the only way that the loss can go down is if, in fact, your steps are correlated with the gradient. If they're uncorrelated with the gradient, there's no way that you will actually reduce the loss. So Conrad Korting and I published an article in the Journal of Physiology, an opinion piece, where we argue, you know, given these considerations, arguably the study of synaptic plasticity has always actually been about the study of gradients. I will just say this was the crowning achievement of my career because this was the actual graphical abstract for our article, which I actually originally sent in to the Journal of Physiology, assuming they would object to it as a joke, and then they just published it. So that was fun. Anyway, and indeed, because gradient descent, or at least algorithms that are correlated with gradient descent, seem to be the only way that we can train high-dimensional systems effectively, what we've seen over the last few years is that computational neuroscience, now that we are trying to build non-toy normative models, has taken on gradient descent as the tool, the go-to tool for training our normative models. So when you search Google Scholar, this was a few months ago, but something probably still similar holds. You know, the classic synaptic plasticity rule in neuroscience is a Hebbian plasticity rule. And yet when you do a Google Scholar search, you see that Hebbian learning neuroscience produces fewer results than gradient descent neuroscience, which just indicates how much the neuroscience community has taken this on. And you can go and find thousands of papers that use gradient descent to train neural network models in computational neuroscience as a field. So for practical and theoretical reasons, gradient descent has become dominant in computational neuroscience. Now, there are a variety of problems with gradient descent, though, when we are actually considering it as a model of learning in the brain. My lab has done a lot of work in this area. We've worked with Joshua's lab on this as well. We've worked with Tim Lillicrap and other people on trying to think about how you could potentially estimate gradients, or at least have algorithms that are correlated with gradients using physiologically realistic mechanisms. But another one of the basic physiological principles that gradient descent violates that we rarely have actually thought of in this work is Dale's law. Now, Dale's law is actually not a law. There are almost no laws in biology. Biology will always find things that violate whatever you say is a law. But we can maybe refer to Dale's principle, which is that for most of the neurons in the brain, we see that these neurons can only release a single type of neurotransmitter from their axon terminals. And what that means practically is that neurons can only have an excitatory effect on their postsynaptic partners or an inhibitory effect. That's because whether or not a neuron has an inhibitory or excitatory effect on its postsynaptic partner largely has to do with the neurotransmitter that it releases from its terminal. There are two primary neurotransmitters in the brain. I actually have them tattooed on my arms here, glutamate and GABA. Glutamate is the excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, and when it is released, it will typically depolarize the cell and make it more active, the postsynaptic cell, whereas GABA is the inhibitory neurotransmitter, and when it is released, it will inhibit the cell by hyperpolarizing it and making it less active. And because of Dale's principle, neurons cannot switch, like the vast majority of neurons in the brain, cannot switch from releasing GABA to releasing glutamate or vice versa. And practically, from a modeling perspective, that means that you cannot change the sign of your synapses. In the real brain, synapses from a given neuron have to be all positive or all negative, and they cannot switch. And of course, gradient descent won't respect that. So gradient descent will violate Dale's law. If you have synapses that are positive, your gradient very well might push them into negative territory or vice versa. So to contend with this issue and think about how we could potentially align with neuroscience better while still maintaining the power of gradient descent, my group stepped back and we went and looked through the machine learning literature and discovered this whole rich literature that considers learning rules from another step of abstraction away from just gradient descent. And instead, this is from the optimization literature and just asks, like, how should you actually optimize a system in general? And the core idea that some researchers have put forward is that the way you want to think about it is that the question you're really asking, or should be asking yourself, is how can you improve the behavior of your network as much as possible for as little synaptic change as possible? So this equation here is just saying that your next set of synaptic weights, the weights at WT plus 1, should be whatever synaptic weights W minimize this expression, where here this is your loss function, and this is a measurement of how much the synapses would change if you went from the current synapses WT to these new synapses W. So you can think of this as a measurement of proximity in synaptic space. It's basically a way of measuring how far away the new synapses are from the current synaptic settings. And what's interesting is that if you then figure out what learning algorithms give you this argmin W, you will derive different algorithms, some of which we're very familiar with, depending on the proximity penalty term you use. So here, I've shifted to a linear approximation to the loss. So this is just how can we minimize this linear approximation of the loss. And then here, this is our proximity penalty term, and eta is going to be our learning rate. Now, if you set your proximity penalty term to be Euclidean distance, which is a fairly obvious one to use, and then you figure out what weight update minimizes this expression, the answer is gradient descent. So gradient descent is actually just the answer to this question: how can we improve behavior as much as possible for as little synaptic change as possible? The answer is, if you're using Euclidean distance to measure the distance, then you should use gradient descent. However, you don't have to use Euclidean distance. So another distance function, or maybe not technically a distance function, but another proximity penalty term that's been used in the optimization literature is the unnormalized Kullback-Leibler divergence. So here, what we've got is the Kullback-Leibler divergence plus the sum of differences between the weights. And if you take this proximity penalty term, you end up, and you solve for the minimum of this equation, you get this different algorithm called exponentiated gradient. If you look here at the expression, it uses the gradient as well. So you're still using the gradient, which is sensible. As I said, you're going to have to use some gradient information if you want to take a small step size and reduce your loss. But in this case, the update you get is actually your current weights times e to the negative gradient. So a different learning algorithm from gradient descent with different properties. Moreover, one of those properties is that this algorithm respects Dale's law. So unlike gradient descent, which will happily push your positive weights to negative or your negative weights to positive, because of the fact that this proximity penalty is undefined for a change in the sign of the synapses, you can see here that what you end up getting is a learning rule that will not change the sign of your weights. If I have negative weights at time t, I cannot change the sign by multiplying them by e to the negative something. So negative weights stay negative, positive weights stay positive. Dale's law can be respected. And here's just a plot of that synaptic distance penalty to give that intuition. So in gradient descent, ultimately synapses are considered far away simply if they are far away in space in the most intuitive sense of it. But in the case of using the unnormalized Kullback-Leibler divergence, we have instead this proximity penalty where we've got undefined in sign switches. Okay, so as an interim summary, gradient descent is widely used in computational neuroscience because it's very effective at training normative models. I mean, I can tell you that as someone who has done computational neuroscience work for several decades now, it was always very frustrating when you would try to train a model on some relatively toy task that's kind of like what animals do, like controlling a simple arm or recognizing images, and you couldn't do it. And gradient descent ended up always being our go-to because we were like, I'm tired of this model not training properly. Let's train it with gradient descent and then we can study what it does. But gradient descent does violate some fundamental properties of neurophysiology, including Dale's law. However, from first principles of optimization, we can derive an alternative learning algorithm, exponentiated gradient, or EG, that does respect Dale's law by construction. And so now what we've been exploring in my lab is this question: is EG better for using in computational neuroscience? In particular, does it end up aligning with the phenomenological level better than what we actually see with gradient descent? Okay, so testing exponentiated gradients. Does EG align with empirical data in neuroscience better than gradient descent? All right, so we began with the following question, which you will see in a moment why we went here. So one of the interesting phenomenological features of synapses in the brain is that across regions and species, to date, the data has shown that synaptic weights tend to follow a log normal distribution. So here, these are a set of experiments where people will do recordings of connected pairs of neurons, and they will simply examine what is the magnitude of the postsynaptic response to those neurons, and here, to input from those neurons. And here you can see a plot of the density that people have gotten, in this case from mouse barrel cortex and rat visual cortex. And since this is a logarithmic axis here, you can see that both of these distributions follow roughly a log normal distribution. And this has been seen in other species and brain regions as well, fairly consistently. Now, could we possibly link these different learning algorithms to different weight distributions? The answer is yes, but to explain how we get there, we're going to have to step back for a moment into the theory and talk about specifically this area of theory known as mirror descent. So apologies to anyone who works in optimization theory, because this is not my area of expertise, and if I misstate anything, feel free to correct me. But in optimization theory from mirror descent, we have this interesting approach that specifically considers the class of proximity penalties known as Bregman divergences. So a Bregman divergence is based on a convex potential function. You have some convex potential function, h, and the Bregman divergence will measure for you the difference between that potential function and a linear approximation of the potential function for some given point estimated from another point. So if we're at WT in our synapses and we have some potential function, the Bregman divergence is basically telling us how much does your potential function diverge from a linear approximation of the distance between these 2 points. So what happens is that you define your potential function, and the potential function then defines your proximity penalty. So in the case of the Euclidean distance, the potential function is just the squared norm of your vector. In the case of in the case of the unnormalized callback-Wheeler divergence, it's the negative entropy. And so you can think about this not just in terms of proximity penalties, but in terms of potential functions. They are one and the same. A given potential function will implicate a given proximity penalty function. And then the way that this unrolls within the theory is that the way that we can think about doing synaptic updates is actually that the potential function is a way of mapping into a different space for doing our weight updates, known as the dual space. So specifically, the gradient of the potential function will determine a projection of your current synaptic weights into this dual space. And then what you do is you actually do gradient descent in the dual space, and then you come back to your synaptic space via the inverse of your potential function. So this is how mirror descent as a general approach to optimization works. You take your synapses, you project them into the dual space, you do an update in the dual space. The dual space is where things are nice and linear, basically, is the idea, where things obey a Euclidean geometry. So you're projecting into this Euclidean geometry space, you do gradient descent, and then you project back into this non-Euclidean potentially space here called the primal space, typically. If you want to as well, often within this theory, people will impose some constraints and force you to project back. But you can ignore that for now. We're not doing that here. Now, how are we going to use this to connect to data? So in a paper that we published as an iClear Spotlight in 2023, my postdoc, Roman Pogodin, produced a really interesting proof that I 3/4 understand, which shows that if you have synaptic changes that are sufficiently small, such that you're in the lazy regime of training and can approximate things with an appropriate linear kernel, and your data has a certain limit on the amount of correlation in it, then you can show that no matter what loss function or data your network receives, if you look at the distribution of synaptic changes in the dual space, it should be Gaussian. So what do I mean by that? So let's imagine that we have some synaptic weights here in in orange, say, before training, and then some synaptic weights after training here in blue. And then we look at the change in synaptic weights that occur, and then we project those synaptic weight changes into the dual space using the gradient of our potential function. If we have the correct potential function and the correct proximity function, the distribution of those synaptic changes will be Gaussian, no matter what loss we're training on. Okay, so in the case of a neural network, that's very easy to specify. What was the actual potential function that you used to train the neural network, to optimize the neural network? In the case of the brain, now, this is welcome to science and life sciences. Now, when we talk about the correct potential function, we're basically asking, what is the best approximation of what's really happening in the brain? However, if you have the incorrect proximity function or the incorrect potential function, you will get non-Gaussian updates in the dual space. So as I said, Roman provides a proof of this, but we also wanted to demonstrate it empirically. Actually, I don't have that demonstration here. I can provide it for you later if you're interested, but you can also show this holds for a deep neural network. So if you train a deep neural network with a given proximity penalty, and then you look at the synaptic changes that happened, and you project those into different dual spaces by using different potential functions, whatever potential function you actually train the network with will give you a Gaussian distribution in the dual space. And this works for a bunch of different tasks, a bunch of different network architectures. It really does seem to be quite general. Now, this is interesting with respect to exponentiated gradient and that previous data I showed you on log normal weight distributions in the brain, because if your potential function is the negative entropy, the gradient of that ends up being just the log on your weights. And so now, if you project your weights into the dual space, you're going to, and you have a log normal distribution, you're going to get a Gaussian distribution. And then when you update them with a Gaussian weight change, you're going to still have a Gaussian distribution. And now when you project back with the inverse, which will be the exponent, you'll end up getting a log normal distribution. In other words, exponentiated gradient will take log normal weight distributions and keep them log normal. It will not change them from log normal to something else. And that's really interesting then, given that we consistently see log normal weight distributions throughout the brain. So we wanted to test this empirically with some, I say here, neural relevant tasks. Really what I mean is some of the tasks that computational neuroscientists are using frequently in their studies right now. So this is a particular example, a very popular set of cognitive tasks known as ModCog that's used widely in computational neuroscience. It was first introduced by Robert Yang in 2019 and now has been updated in a recent paper from Ila Fiat's lab in neural computation. And basically what it is, it's a very simple set of tests where the neural network will receive two different stimuli that come in circular form. So just stimulus 1 and stimulus 2. It also receives another input that specifies some rule for how it should respond to these stimuli when a fixation input drops. And then it has to respond based on the rule. Now, the rules will be things like, there are 80 different tasks, in fact, defined here. So one rule could be, all right, if modality 1 is different from modality 2, then you should output modality 1. Whereas if modality 1 is the same as modality 2, then you should output the opposite of modality 1, or something like that. They just make up different rules for how you should combine stimulus 1 and stimulus 2. And the reason they've designed it this way, just to explain, is that people have done many tasks with humans and primates of exactly this sort. So we've got lots of behavioral data of people and monkeys performing these tasks. So you can train a neural network to do these tasks. It's fairly easy. And the work that's been done by computational neuroscientists to date so far has been often studying the fixed points in the networks that are learned by this to try to link those to potential dynamics we see in the brain. But in our case here, what we just wanted to see is, at first, is it true that we're going to stick with log normal weight distributions if we train with exponentiated gradient? And is it also true that we won't if we train with gradient descent? So first, comparing exponentiated gradient to gradient descent, you can see that both algorithms easily solve this toy task. Moreover, when you look at the list of 80 tasks and the accuracy across different checkpoints, interestingly, they also seem to learn the different tasks at similar speeds to one another. So in some ways, at a purely just like baseline performance level, the algorithms are largely indistinguishable. But what's interesting is when you examine the synaptic weight distributions, so here we initialized the networks with log normal weight distributions. When you examine the synaptic weight distributions after training, if you had trained it with gradient descent, it's no longer log normally distributed because this is a logarithmic axis here. Whereas if you train it with EG, it is still log normally distributed. So indeed, EG will keep you in log normal weight distributions, gradient descent will not. Okay, so EG seems to be better than GD in its respect for basic physiological principles, namely Dale's law, and more in line with the phenomenological evidence we have from neuroscience. So we then wanted to ask, can it provide any functional advantages that might be relevant for the brain? So the first advantage that we identified is that EG is better at dealing with synaptic pruning. Now let me explain what that means. So one of the things that has been consistently observed in the developing brain is that the early brain produces way more synapses than ultimately exist in the adult brain. So the initial brain has tons and tons of synapses, and then over the course of maturation, you will prune away many of those synapses, particularly actually if you get sensory experience. So we know that there's this big loss of synapses during development, but of course, from a computational or algorithmic perspective, there's the question of how can the brain adapt to those loss of synapses? So this is interesting with respect to EG, precisely because one of the things that that log normal weight distribution gives you is that there is this long tail of synaptic weights. So you have a set of very strong synaptic weights, a small set of very strong synaptic weights that the network seems to rely on for doing its computations, rather than relying on the larger mass of synaptic weights in the population. So what we asked was, what happens if we train on those modcog tasks and then we prune the network? So we both examine what happens if we prune some synapses and then just look at the immediate performance of the network, and what happens if we prune the synapses and then retrain on the modcog tasks as well. So to begin with, here's what you see in terms of the accuracy without any retraining. So on the left, this is the response accuracy averaged across all of the 80 modcog tasks as a function of the percentage of synapses that we prune. Now, of course, at 100% synapses pruned, you get 0 performance. So you can't prune to any level. But what you see critically is that the fall off in performance is slower for EG than GD. And that's because EG is relying on, I should have said here, the way we prune the synapses is we prune small synapses. So we basically just set a threshold for what is the percentile of small synapses that we're going to cut. And because EG relies on a smaller set of larger synapses, you can cut a higher percentage of synapses and maintain a pretty good accuracy, like such that you can even prune up to 70% almost of your synapses and still have pretty good performance on your original tasks. Yeah.
Mostly, as I understand it, it's because the exponentiated gradient, if you look at its update, is pushing things to 0 when you're not, whereas the other one may cross.
Yes, that as well. That's right. Exactly. So you're getting these sort of this sparser set of synaptic modules that are handling your task, and the things that aren't useful, it just kind of pushes towards 0. Yeah. Yeah.
There should be a sweet spot for pruning.
Right.
But it's only going worse.
Oh, I see. So I'm not sure that there should be a sweet spot. We don't have any reason to think that there is a good level of pruning from a purely computational perspective in terms of, maybe from a generalization perspective, but in terms of tasks you've already learned, I would not expect to see any benefit from any level of pruning.
But there is benefit in human connectomics as it gets more modular during human development. Then certain tasks start to emerge, like social tasks, theory of minds.
The thing is, though, we don't know if that's because of the pruning and the modularization, or because the course of development over which people are learning those tasks also follows the course of pruning. Now, it might be related to some generalization, but I don't think we have any reason to believe that the pruning itself is the thing that's making us good at those tasks.
But evolution doesn't do random things.
Well, I mean, sometimes it does if it doesn't kill you, actually. It does lots of random things. Yeah, but moreover, I think it's important to recognize that there's a very good reason for evolution to prune away synapses, and that is that they represent an energetic expense and material expense for the brain. So if you can maintain your performance while getting rid of a bunch of your synapses, that's good.
There was one more question here. Yeah.
I was just curious about the method you use for pruning, because to me it seems that this method will influence like this comparison, because you have some particular method that use laser regularization and can push the weight towards 0. So you should recover like maybe something that is more similar to that.
Yeah, so I mean, the method we're using here is that smaller synapses get pruned, and that's based on what we see in the brain. So when people have studied this in the brain, what they observe is that it tends to be the smaller synapses that disappear. large ones are left intact. And that's why we adopted this.
So when you're doing gradient descent, are you applying regularization to try to?
Yeah, I should say we're applying regularization. We actually apply weight decay in both of these algorithms. Yeah. To your point, though, there's one other interesting thing, which I think is that if you have a set of semi-orthogonalized synaptic modules for doing different tasks, that can also help avoid interference. So there's an additional potential computational benefit there. Now, this is just showing on the right here the intuition for what's happening. If you compare the cosine similarity of your weight vector for your pruned and unpruned networks, it's much more similar in the case of EG, and that's just because you are getting rid of these small synapses that have been set close to zero and keeping the big ones, so the overall vector is maintained, as it were. And then here's what happens when you now retrain the network. So here what we did is we pruned the network to different fairly extreme levels so that we really hit the performance of the network hard, and then we retrained on the tasks. And again, interestingly, EG has an advantage here where it can more rapidly regain its performance compared to GD, likely because of the way that it's relying on a smaller set of large synapses again. And here we show it for 92.5 and 95% pruned. Okay. Now, the next advantage that we explored is the ability to identify relevant inputs from noise. So this was motivated by some very old work. So it turns out, I should say, exponentiated gradient is a really old algorithm. There was work from people back in the 80s and 90s on this kind of stuff. And in fact, Doina told me she worked on EG for her master's thesis. So one of the early things that was demonstrated analytically and empirically is that if you have a task where you have a bunch of connections, but only a subset of them are relevant to performing the task, the rest of them are noise, then exponentiated gradient is actually a superior algorithm for linear regression. So it was proved for linear regression. So if you're doing linear regression and only a subset of your inputs are actually relevant to doing the regression, exponentiated gradient is superior. So in this case, actually it's nonlinear, it's basically logistic regression. So you have to output a 1 if more than 50 of the relevant inputs are active, and then there's n overall inputs. And we do here, the way that we make it relevant or irrelevant is that we have a teacher network where only some of the weights are actually non-zero, and those are the ones, of course, that the student network that's trying to follow this regression should learn. So if you do this as expected from the old literature, what you can see is that both of the algorithms can learn this task. So in the case where 100 out of 200 neurons, input neurons, are relevant, the algorithms are basically pretty identical in terms of their performance. But if you increase the number of irrelevant neurons, so you have 2,000 neurons now and only 100 of them are relevant as inputs, then EG can outperform gradient descent. Now, what's interesting is this also holds in a biophysical simulation. So here we did a collaboration with Brendan Bicknell and Kevin Sheng at UCL. They were doing biophysical simulations of pyramidal neurons that had been reconstructed, their full dendritic tree, all of the ionic currents being simulated, blah, 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 blah. And what they did is they did basically that what we call the R of K task. So you give the system many, many synapses, and the goal, you then train your neuron model to spike if more than 50 of the relevant 100 synapses are on, and to not spike if less than 50 of the 100 relevant synapses are off. And you can train these models using the fact that all of the differential equations that govern the voltages and the ionic currents are all differentiable, so you can run gradients through your entire biophysical model. And here you can see what happens before training. The neuron might spike to both inputs regardless of whether or not 46 or 51 are active, but after training it will not respond to 46 but will respond to 51 inputs on. And we basically examined what happens if we train the biophysical model. Here with 3,000 synapses, only 100 of them are relevant, using either EG or GD, and EG had a clear accuracy improvement relative to GD. Okay, lastly, to explore this, we moved to a slightly less toy task. So here we got the help from Olivier Codel, who's here at Mila, who's done a lot of work on motor control. And so he built a simulated arm that does reaching tasks in a 2D plane. The arm has a series of muscles that the system can apply torque to change the angle of the arm. And the goal is you're at some starting location, and then you receive a target signal, and you have to push the arm out to touch the target signal. This is a very common task in motor control with humans and primates. And you do this using proprioceptive inputs. So the inputs that the neural network receives is basically a measurement of what your joint angles are for your arm, and you then have to output the torque commands, the muscle commands, to control the arm. And to make this interesting for our purposes here, what we did is we added a bunch of irrelevant feedback signals. So we basically generated noise with similar statistics to the actual feedback that the arms will get, that you get from the arm, sorry. And we fed those into the neural network in addition to the actual arm signals while it was learning to perform this task. Now, this is biologically relevant because, of course, your motor cortex receives a lot of different inputs that have nothing to do with your current task. If I ask you to reach for something, it's not like all the other inputs from the rest of your brain go silent while you're doing this, other than your proprioceptive inputs. Somehow your motor cortex is able to ignore all those other inputs and just pay attention to the proprioception inputs in order to do your task. So here you can see that the training works. Before training, the network will start at the X and not really make it to the different targets. After training, it can track nicely from the X's to the targets that we give it. And here are the performance differences for EG and GD. So again, in this case, when we add in the irrelevant inputs, we see that EG has a performance advantage over GD. This is some example reaches at 3,000 updates. This is some example reaches at 6,000 updates. And what you can see is that what's happening is that EG converges much more rapidly to some nice smooth pursuits, whereas GD is still doing a lot of this weird oscillatory and jittery stuff. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. How should we use these results? So the takeaway message is that we want, as I said at the start, multi-level models. We want normative models that we can actually train to do the sorts of things that animals do, which traditional computational neuroscience rules like Hebbian plasticity do not allow us to do. But we want those models to start to move towards more phenomenological and eventually, of course, biophysical realism. As an initial step towards this, we have asked, can we at least develop a learning algorithm, or not develop, we didn't develop this learning algorithm. Can we just use a learning algorithm that is as effective as gradient descent, generally speaking, maybe even more effective in the conditions that we want to consider for computational neuroscience, but which has some of the nice phenomenological properties that we know from the brain. In particular, does it, in this case, we were examining the principle of Dale's law. Does it produce log normal weight distributions? And can it recover from pruning? Can it detect sparse signals and handle noise? And what I've shown you is that EG checks all these boxes and GD doesn't. So what we're trying to argue to the computational neuroscience community right now is everyone's using gradient descent to train your networks. That's all well and good, but we propose that you should actually use EG. It will be just as effective at training your networks, but you can train models that respect Dale's law and which you do these other sort of more biological things with, and it will work better for you and be a better fit to the data. So I'll end on a thought with how this could potentially help AI. As I said at the start, my lab tries both to use machine learning theory to help us better understand the brain, but we also do sometimes try to use insights from neuroscience to improve AI. Now, of course, EG has already existed within AI for a long time, so it's not that we're introducing something new here, but the fact that EG might be a better fit to what's going on in the brain and the ways in which we see that it's helpful do suggest that there are certain scenarios where AI practitioners might actually be well advised to use EG rather than GD. And those situations are, one, if you're learning in the face of many irrelevant inputs. So if we imagine moving towards models where we have very large networked systems and a lot of the stuff coming in is not relevant to the task you're training on, it could actually be better to learn with EG. If you want to be able to prune your networks afterwards or reshape them, it might actually be better to train your networks with EG. So if you're, say, trying to develop edge computing or something like that, where you're going to want to cut back a lot of your network, you might be better advised to use EG over GD. And lastly, this is sort of an interesting area as well. In theory, if you're using quantized synaptic weights to try to reduce the amount of energy that you have to use for shuffling around your weights in your system, it might be good to use log quantized weights because that will allow you to have a larger range of synaptic weights with relatively low bit resolution. But if you're learning with log quantized weights, it should be actually better to do EG rather than GD because EG is going to move smoothly between your log quantized bins in a nice way, whereas GD is going to struggle sometimes to move into the larger bins. Okay, so that's that. I want to thank the folks who did this research. So Roman Pogodin, who developed a lot of the theory, well, almost all of the theory on relating different potential functions to synaptic weight distributions. Johnny Cornford, the postdoc who did a lot of the explorations of the implications of EG for computational neuroscience, who has, good for him, sad for us, now got a job at Leeds University. And Arna Ghosh, a PhD student in my lab who helped support all this, who also now is leaving the lab, sadly, but is going off to work for Google. And I also want to thank Gauthier, Guillaume, Olivier, and Brendan and Kevin, who helped us immensely with this work. Thanks in particular to Gauthier, who helped guide us as we waded into uncharted waters for us in optimization theory. And of course, thanks to funders, etc. That's that.
Okay, thank you so much, Blake. There's now some time for questions, and I'll start online first, like with just one question. Elahe online asks, is there a framework to try this learning algorithms for deep learning methods?
So I'm not 100% sure what the question is asking. Yeah, like you can train deep neural networks with EG, no problem. We've done it a lot. It's been done by many others for a long time. So I mean, remember, EG is just a fairly straightforward learning algorithm, right? Like if I go back to the
she's clarifying, I think also workable code. She's asking.
Oh, she's asking, is there code?
I guess
yes.
Yeah, okay.
We have released a code base for doing EG in PyTorch.
Okay, cool. And I guess I'll move on. Are there any
you can see if you go to our bioRxiv paper. Do I link that here at the end? Maybe I don't. But Cornford et al. On bioRxiv, I think we've got a link to the code. if it's not there, just drop me a message. I'm happy to share that code base with anyone.
Okay, awesome. I'll hand it over here.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to say, great talk. I think
Thank
a lot
you.
of your results are very compelling, also from like a neuroscience perspective. I was wondering, for some of the ModCog sort of behavioral outputs and so on you were looking at, were those all from monkeys and humans, or are there ever like simpler model organisms used for those?
Those tasks are generally done by monkeys and humans, in large part because, you know, there's an interesting reality, which is that it is hard to get other organisms to learn arbitrary tasks. Sometimes you can get rats and occasionally mice to learn arbitrary tasks, but when you give a truly arbitrary task where it's just like, okay, here's some variables, mix them together according to this random rule I give you, it's generally hard to get anything but at least a primate to do that task.
Thanks for the talk. I'm curious. There's a couple mathematical coincidences. So one of them is if you use mirror update, where your potential function is the particular one you've chosen, you're taking the Hessian of relative entropy, which happens to be the Fisher information. And when you conjugate by the Fisher information, you get sort of a natural geometry for probabilistic models. And so you're doing weight updates in the Fisher geometry. And so I'm wondering if you've tried different potential functions to try and disentangle the natural Fisher geometry from so is this just the result of using the natural geometry for the parameter space, or is it specifically about the mirror descent or is it specifically about the EG form?
So I don't have a direct answer to your question because we have not tried. In our case, we were really interested in exploring the implications of EG because it respected Dale's law. But there are a lot of interesting connections between this work and things like natural gradient descent and thinking about the natural space for the parameters and doing updates there. It is possible that maybe one alternative interpretation for what we're seeing is that you know, it's somehow a more natural space to be doing our updates in the space defined, the dual space defined by the negative entropy potential function. But I don't think it's quite, like, it's certainly not exactly natural gradient descent, for example. You will get a slightly different geometry if you're trying to do it specifically with something that is obeying the geometry defined by your Fisher information, I believe.
Thanks. I'm also interested on your thoughts about you know, gradient is a vector field.
Yeah.
And in differential geometry, the exponential map takes your vector field to an update in space. So in some sense, you fixed a type error in gradient descent by putting the exponential in. Do you have, is that just a, I mean, it's a different sense of the word exponential, but do you think that that's just a coincidence?
This is really interesting. I don't fully understand what you're saying. Can you explain that again to me, please? So when you've got a gradient field, you're saying, like you apply an exponential to it. What?
So there's something known as the exponential map in differential geometry, and that's just where you follow the gradient field for time equals 1.
Okay.
It suffices to describe the solutions to ODEs. And so the way that you make an update with a gradient field is you have to apply the exponential map to resolve the type error. So you have to wrap a gradient update in.
What's the type error? I think that's what I'm not
because
understanding.
A gradient, a tangent vector, you can't. It's just an infinitesimal amount. In order to go from the tangent space to the space itself, you need to integrate somehow.
I see. Okay.
And the exponential map, it's called that for Lie algebra reasons, but it takes you from the tangent space to the space itself. So an actual update in your weights has to have some sort of exponential map involved. Usually it doesn't mean exponentiating, but in this case, it exactly does correspond to exponentiating. Right. Well, depending on how you set it up, that's a good point. But it's not really an exponential in the same sense. True, but somehow, I'm wondering.
That's interesting. There might be a link there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't have sufficient knowledge to ultimately say whether we have fixed that type error in using exponentiated gradient? Because it sounds like maybe it's a slightly different formulation. Like, do you get, if you follow those updates in using the system you're describing, do you get the kind of update that we get where your update is your current parameters times e to the negative gradient? If so, then I guess, yes, that might be another aspect of what we're doing. But yeah, if you have anything on this, I'd be curious to see it. Like if there's any papers you can point me to, or tutorials, I suppose, because we're talking low level stuff.
Sure. I'll relinquish the mic for now.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Very maybe naive question. My understanding of why gradient descent is biologically implausible, at least the main reason was the having a direction, one direction in synapses, basically, that you don't have two directions of transfer of information, so the gradient information cannot go back. Now I understand if there are other problems and this is solving the other problem, but I'm wondering, so first, is that true? And then if it is, then could it be that this sort of update that you're getting could potentially point to a different kind of algorithm that wouldn't be directly doing gradient descent?
So you're right that one of the first things that people noticed as a potential problem with doing specifically back propagation. So I think it's worth being clear, right? Like gradient descent can be done in a variety of different ways. And depending on your model, the gradient update might not involve back propagating errors through your pathways. But if you're thinking about specifically back propagation in a multi-layer network, then yes, what you just said is correct. One of the first like biological problems you can see in the update is that you have to somehow propagate the errors backwards through the synapses. And although there's some evidence for this, and this is actually something my lab has explored, that there are some chemical signals that travel backwards through the synapses, it also doesn't, it's not immediately clear that this would be a viable way of doing it. Now, it should be said that people, as I said, really were realizing this long ago. And arguably, the last decade of research in this area has produced now dozens of potential solutions to this problem. So even if we don't allow ourselves to send chemical signals directly back through the synapses, there are a variety of alternative ways of sending back error signals via a different pathway that still allow you to approximate your gradients effectively using very physiological mechanisms. So I would characterize that problem, I guess, as solved from the theory perspective. Where it's not solved from the neuroscience perspective is, of the dozens of solutions that people have proposed to address that problem, we don't know which one is actually relevant to the brain, if any. Now, in the case of EG, you still need the gradient to do your update. So you're still going to face that same problem to some extent of how do you estimate your gradient. So it doesn't resolve that for you, unfortunately. But because there are all these solutions on offer, I'm less bothered by that. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Looks like Laurent has one.
Yeah, sorry.
Anyway, thanks, Blake. This is a really fascinating talk. I guess I had a question about your last slide about sort of conjectures about AI.
Yeah.
So I guess on one end, you're saying, you know, EG or EG's been, we've known about this for decades, and we've been, you know, trying to train these larger AI models for a while also. And I think people are always sort of trying the best thing. And so I guess I wonder a little bit, it seems like some of the problems we care about have maybe at least, you know, elements 1 and 2, or at least 1, I would say. 2 could probably have some gains, but at least 1. So why aren't we, so do you have a conjecture or ideas on why maybe EG has not made its way into large scale training of AI models?
So 2 thoughts about that. The first is that if we look at the kind of canonical large model problem, i.e. language models, then I'm not sure that one actually holds. Because generally, if I give you a token of a string of tokens from some language inputs, the vast majority of the dimensions in all those tokens are probably at least a little bit relevant to the problem of predicting the next word, for example, right? So like, it's not the case that when you read a sentence, only 1/10 of the words are relevant to predicting the next thing that's going to come in the sentence. So it's maybe not the case that one holds here.
But so I totally agree, but I would wonder though, this is true for pre-training, but in sort of fine tuning, then we look at other types of things, including RL, including, maybe super long context where the information is very,
Yes.
very far and it's like very, at a one point, I guess, but
I agree.
thing.
No, I agree. I think there might be context. So you're right. Even with pure language modeling, if you have a really long context window, actually, you might get to the point with a sufficiently long context window that actually many of the inputs are irrelevant to the current token prediction problem for pre-training. Or alternatively, as you say, for if you're fine-tuning on a specific task, then very much so it could be the case that actually of the 1,000,000 tokens in your context window, only 1,000 of them are relevant to giving the correct answer. My honest guess is that none of the companies building models have tried EG on their models. Because this is like, this algorithm has been around for a long time, but it is on optimization theory. It's not the thing, I don't mean this badly, but it's not the kind of thing that your average, software engineer in Silicon Valley has read about. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, well, but I think there's a certain conservatism amongst the groups training large models for a good reason. Like, I have, in my interactions with folks at Google who train Gemini and just talking to other researchers who build large models, there's always some degree of conservatism because they're like, if they have something that works and they're going to spend millions of dollars on training a model, why the hell would they try doing something that doesn't potentially work? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe someone's tried it and it didn't work for reasons that I don't know.
Okay, I'm gonna go with one question online and then Eva's question. So online, someone is asking, is EG or GD fast in training in terms of GPU hours?
In terms of GPU hours, it's basically going to come down to how fast your learning proceeds. So yes, if you're applying it to a situation where EG can learn faster, you could reduce the number of GPU hours required because you will not have to train for as long. Now, in terms of a general reduction of GPU hours, at face value, it's not immediately clear how you can reduce your GPU hours using EG because you're still calculating a gradient. So you still got to do all the same calculations via your compute graph that you do for normal gradient descent. The only thing that might be interesting this way is, again, if you then shift towards prune networks, or maybe using masks on your synaptic weights where you only propagate gradients for certain synapses, maybe EG could help you in that case, and maybe you could reduce your computational input.
Okay, and then
Thank you for the talk. I thought it was really
Thanks.
great and very easy to understand. So
Cool.
as someone who is not a neuroscientist, I wanted to ask a bit about the relationship between pruning and learning, and how I assume that we are sort of constantly learning and constantly pruning.
Yep.
And so in your experiments, the pruning seemed to be done sort of after the fact.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you had kind of looked into what the effect is if you do this throughout the process of learning, and does that in any way change the results if you're doing pruning together?
That's a great question. The unfortunate answer is no, we haven't tried that, but I think it would be really a neat next step from a developmental perspective, because you're right, we probably constantly learn and prune. In fact, one of the things that might happen, there's some evidence for this, is that basically when we sleep, we prune back a bunch of synapses. So you could imagine doing constant cycles of train up, prune, train up, prune, train up, prune, etc.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe one last question to Alex.
Try to be quick, but I actually have two. One ML, one neuroscience. Very
Sure.
quickly, the machine learning one is simpler. I was wondering, so weight initialization was very important at the time, to make neural networks work and so on. I wonder if actually it would matter a lot. Like we would need different weight initializations to use EG, different than the ones we use for gradient descents. I don't know if you've thought of that. The neuroscience one is, as you said before to CMAC's question, so you're proposing a new model for updates, synaptic updates, one of many, of course, in the literature. But this one in particular, have you thought of the kind of experiments or evidence that would be needed to say, well, this actually happens or could happen in the brain? How would you, physiologically, chemically, what is needed to go a step farther to say, it's not that it actually works and matches some things like Dale's law, etc. But what would prevent that?
So on the first question, we have tested many different initialization schemes. EG generally works reasonably well across all the standard initialization schemes for neural networks, but it does work quite well with log normal initializations in particular. But as long as you respect some of the core kind of spectral properties of your weight initialization that you need for training any neural network well, EG tends to work well. On the second question, so there's two answers that way. The first is you can get some initial evidence for this if you did the sort of experiment that we did with our neural networks, where you examine the synaptic weight distribution in an animal before training, then you train it, then you examine the weight distribution after, you examine that difference, and you see if the differences are Gaussian if you transform them with the negative entropy potential gradient. But that's still just like a sort of like one piece of evidence in favor of it. It doesn't necessarily really nail it down. To really nail it down, what you'd need to do is you'd need to be able to directly measure. This is where things would get complicated. You need to be able to say, for every neuron, what is its contribution to the gradient on some task, and then look at the current synaptic weights and see whether over learning you see the synaptic weights changing according to e to the negative gradient of the contribution of that neuron to the task. That's complicated, but possibly doable. Actually, we've got collaborators at the Allen Institute who are trying to think about how to do these sorts of experiments. They've got some the way that neuroscientists are dealing with this is we're using brain-computer interfaces for the tasks. So basically what you do is you set up a task where you're recording activity from a group of neurons, and the task for the animal is simply that they have to activate a certain pattern of the neurons. And the loss that you give the animal is literally just the difference between the activity pattern that you see in the brain and the target activity pattern you give the animals. Now, what's nice about that then is you know the gradient of your problem because directly you have defined it on these neurons. So you don't have to somehow figure out the gradient out through the, go away. You don't have to figure out the gradient out through the behavioral control. However, so that's fine. That's very technically doable. The challenge is it's actually very hard to measure synaptic changes in real time in neurons. And we don't have great techniques for that yet. Right now, what they're literally doing at the Allen Institute is they will record activity and then they'll activate with a laser a bunch of presynaptic synapses and look at the impact on the postsynaptic cell. And then you can sort of do that repeatedly. The problem is there's a lot of noise in that measurement technique, and it's challenging to get a really good hold on it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Blake, for this amazing talk and for
Thanks,
the great
Benno.
questions.
And thanks everyone for your great questions.
Yeah, and there's a few more questions online, but maybe just either DM Blake like privately if you have
Yeah.
more questions.
Send me a message on Slack. Happy to take any more questions.